Right, lads. So today we're looking here at the specific defense system. In the previous class, what we had covered was the general defense system. So you might remember in the general defense system, you're talking about the skin as a barrier. You're talking about platelets, which clot the blood. You're talking about white blood cells, which engulf bacteria. You're talking about lactic acid in the female reproductive system, in the vagina. You're talking about sebaceous glands releasing sebum to the skin, and you're talking about lysozymes, which is released, I suppose, in the tears, which kill bacteria. All of those things are general defenses. But today, we're just looking at this other part of the overall immune system, which is the specific defense system. Okay? Now, you probably have an idea about some of these words today because we're hearing an awful lot about it with the COVID crisis at the moment. And probably this one is the one that comes up all the time: antibodies. These are the three key elements of the specific defense system. Okay. What we're talking about is going to be lymphocytes. Lymphocytes, I suppose, should be familiar for you because we have seen the lymphatic system or lymph system. Remember, the lymph system is like a second kind of transport system around the body. And what we have seen there is that there is this kind of pale colored liquid that is comprised of white blood cells called lymphocytes. There's lymph nodes where these white blood cells are found in very high concentrations, and they filter out bacteria. So we probably have an idea here already that these are white blood cells, these lymphocytes. And these lymphocytes, they are a specific type of white blood cell that produce what we call antibodies. So this is the relationship here between these two words here. Lymphocytes produce the antibodies, which are then going to target what we call foreign antigens. And these antigens are present on bacterial cells and viral cells that are infected by viruses as well. So this is the specific defense system that we're looking at. Now, I suppose what I want to raise to your attention is the different way that white blood cells, I suppose, defend our body. You might know at this stage that there are two kind of main groupings of white blood cells. There are the monocytes. So there's no spelling of it there, but it's MONO and CYTES, monocytes. And the monocytes are the ones that you're probably the most familiar with, and they go around and they basically engulf bacteria and cells that are infected by viruses. That's the role of monocytes. They're if you can imagine Pac-Man, and where Pac-Man is going around eating other things. That's what a monocyte does, basically. Okay, but the lymphocytes are adapted to produce these antibodies. Now, when we're talking about the blood cells, we know that they are found in various parts of the body. Okay, so they're found. So these blood cells are found in the spleen. So we mentioned these. Remember, these are the organs that are specific to the immune system. So we talk about spleen, the thymus gland. Okay, so the thymus gland here is found here in the chest, upper chest cavity. We're talking here about the spleen. Okay, so the spleen down here, I suppose, near your stomach, but behind your ribs. So the question is, where are they produced? And we covered this when we covered the blood. The blood cells, like the white blood cells and the red blood cells, they are produced in the bone marrow. Okay, so how do we? There are two different types, I suppose, of two different classifications of lymphocytes. So if you think about it so far, we've already got a classification of white blood cells. The white blood cells are either monocytes or lymphocytes. The monocytes are the ones that engulf, I would say, bacteria. The lymphocytes are the ones that produce antibodies. Well, when we're talking about lymphocytes themselves, the ones that produce antibodies, we have two different classifications of those as well. And those cells are either called B cells or T cells, B lymphocytes or T lymphocytes. Okay? And even though all of those lymphocytes are produced in the bone marrow. So remember, the bone marrow is the tissue found within the bone. These lymphocytes are maturing in different places, and depending on where they mature, I suppose is part of what determines what type of a lymphocyte they are. So the lymphocytes that mature in the thymus gland, okay, which is this upper chest cavity, they are called T lymphocytes. Okay, that's why we call them T lymphocytes, T for thymus. And the B cells actually mature in the bone marrow itself, so they don't leave the bone marrow until they're fully mature. Okay, when we're talking about um, maturity here, what we are talking about is, I suppose, growth. So they over a number of different, I suppose, days and weeks until they're ready to do their job, which is defend the body. So we have got a specific defense system here, as we said, which involves antigens, antibodies, and lymphocytes. And what we're going to look at now is what antigens, I suppose, role is in the human defense system. It's important to highlight here that cells naturally have antigens on the surface of the cell. Okay, these are just little proteins that are found on the outside of a cell. Now, you're talking about in an animal cell, you might be talking about outside of the cell membrane. So it's just a little marker that's on the top of the cell membrane. It's actually a protein-based substance. You have also got these antigens naturally occurring on bacteria. Okay, and when viruses infect cells, they actually put these antigens on the surface as well. So these are like an unusual little marker. I suppose you can think of it kind of like a little flag on the surface of the cell. And the idea is that these markers make them individual. And just like we can recognize, I suppose, people from different countries, our white blood cells also can recognize these antigens. So they recognize if they're familiar. So if I have a human cell in the body which has antigens on its surface, it recognizes if that is a familiar human cell. Also, though, it can recognize if it is a pathogen. So if it does not recognize the antigen, it says, okay, that's basically a foreigner. That's a person that shouldn't be inside in the body. Well, then what happens is it alerts the whole immune system. So when they recognize the bacteria, they recognize the virus, they use the antigens for recognition, and then they mark those cells for basically death. Okay, and that's the role of an antigen here. An antigen is just a protein that's found. It doesn't really do anything itself, except for it's a protein that's found on the surface of these cells, whether it's a good cell or whether it's a cell that's a pathogen. But then they alert the immune system. They can be used to alert the immune system. So you need to learn two definitions here to help you, I suppose, with your leaving cert. And those definitions are what are an antigen and what are antibodies. So an antigen is a protein, as we said, and it is something that causes the production of antibodies by lymphocytes. Okay, so you need to have a few things there in your definition. I've kind of written it out a little bit better in the notes, but an antigen is a protein that causes the production of antibodies by lymphocytes. Okay, and that then leads us on then to antibodies. And antibodies are proteins that are actually produced by lymphocytes in response to those antigens. So you can think of it now of the body's defenses. The body here is its role is to kill these cells. So part of killing these cells involves identifying these antigens, connecting into these antigens. Sometimes that will disable the cells themselves. Other times, what it'll do, if you connect the antibody to the antigen, the cell now can be recognized by the other type of white blood cells, which are the monocytes. And the monocytes come along, they now recognize that, hey, this cell is foreign, we must engulf it and eat it and kill it. So those are the definitions there. Just in your notes if you're writing this down anyway, but remember an antigen is a protein, so it's a protein-based substance that causes the production of antibodies by lymphocytes. You could say it's found on the surface of the cells. The antibodies they are chemicals, okay, that are produced by lymphocytes in response to these antigens. Okay, so it's always a response we're talking about here. Right. So what should we know so far about lymphocytes? So these, you can think about this, you can virtually check this here really in your head. We have got, they're all producing the red bone or the bone marrow. Okay, just don't worry about the red bone marrow, just bone marrow. They're producing the bone marrow. They lymphocytes, um, some of them will produce antibodies. That is a response to antigens on the surface of pathogens. Okay, remember pathogens are disease-causing organisms like bacteria or viruses. Once we find a lymphocyte, okay, once we find an antigen rather, the lymphocyte will mark that pathogen for destruction. Okay, as I said, the monocytes come along and they engulf the abnormal cells. So it could be like abnormal in that it could be foreign, it could be, say, a bacteria or a cell that has been infected by a virus as well. So when we're defeating viruses, what we're really doing is we are engulfing our own cells that are infected by those viruses. It could also be, I suppose, there to I suppose engulf cancerous cells. So that's why we say abnormal. The key thing, though, and this I suppose, remember the antigen is found on the surface of the cell. Okay, of it could be a bacteria or it could be a cell that's infected with viruses. The antigen is found there, but when an antibody is released, only one antibody will match that antigen. Okay, so there's only one match, and this probably reminds you of enzyme substrate reactions because actually it's very similar. So it's very like the induced fit theory in that the antibody will have to fit, be a perfect, it'll have to be an almost perfect match here for the antigen. And if it connects in, then as we said, two things may happen. The first thing may be that it might deactivate the cell may die. And the second thing is that it might mark it so that the monocytes come along and they engulf the bacteria or the virus infected cell. Right. So this is I suppose, a representation here of our blood, and you can see here there's different types of cells. The lymphocyte here is highlighted in purple there down the bottom. Okay, and that lymphocyte there is the one that is capable of producing antibodies. Right. So this will be the final thing that we talk about today. Do you know what? I think actually we have done enough today, so we'll stop there.